Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Droning Professor. Tonight we're going to learn about the ancient battery no one can explain. So, as you make yourselves comfortable, please take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and feel free to subscribe. Now, as always, take a moment for some deep breaths, letting your mind and body relax for a good night of sleep. So, imagine you're an archaeologist in 1936, and you're digging around in the outskirts of Baghdad, which, let me tell you, is already a pretty exciting gig. You're expecting pottery shards, maybe some old coins, perhaps the remnants of someone's 2,000-year-old lunch. What you are definitely not expecting to find is what appears to be an ancient battery. And yet, that's exactly what a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König claimed to have discovered. Now, before we get too far into this, I want you to understand that this object, this so-called Baghdad Battery, has caused more arguments among historians, archaeologists, and scientists than whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Spoiler alert, the battery thing is way more controversial. Let me set the scene properly. It's the late 1930s, and König is working at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. He's looking through various artifacts that have been excavated from a site called Kujut Rabu, which is just outside modern-day Baghdad. Among all these ancient objects, he finds something peculiar. It's a clay jar, about 5 to 6 inches tall. Nothing fancy about the jar itself. But here's where it gets interesting. Inside this jar is a copper cylinder, and inside that copper cylinder is an iron rod. The iron rod is held in place by what appears to be an asphalt stopper at the top. Now, to most people, this would look like, well, ancient trash. Maybe someone's weird science project from 2,000 years ago. But König looked at this thing and thought, hold on a second, this looks like a galvanic cell. For those of you wondering what a galvanic cell is, don't worry, we'll get there. But essentially, König was suggesting this thing could generate electricity. Now, let me be very clear about something right from the start. König didn't actually find this object himself during an excavation. He found it in the museum's collection, where it had been sitting, probably being used as a paperweight for all anyone knew. The actual excavation had been done earlier, and the documentation wasn't exactly what we'd call thorough. We're not even 100% certain exactly where it came from, which, as you can imagine, makes things complicated. It's like someone giving you a mystery casserole and asking you to identify every ingredient when they can't remember where they bought half of them. König published his theory in 1938, suggesting that these objects, because there were actually several of them found, were used for electroplating. Electroplating, for those unfamiliar, is the process of using electricity to coat one metal with another. You know how your cheap jewelry is gold-plated. Same concept, just with more ancient Mesopotamians involved. His idea was that the Parthians, who controlled this region from about 247 BCE to 224 CE, were using these devices to put a thin layer of gold onto silver objects, making them look like solid gold, which, honestly, if true, would make the Parthians the ancient world's equivalent of those guys selling genuine Rolex watches out of a trench coat. Now, let's talk about what the Parthian Empire actually was, because context matters. The Parthians were a major power in ancient Iran and Iraq, and they were kind of a big deal. They fought the Romans to a standstill multiple times, controlled the Silk Road trade routes, and generally made themselves important. They weren't primitive by any stretch. These were people with sophisticated art, architecture, and metallurgy. So the idea that they might have had advanced technology isn't completely absurd on its face. But there's a massive difference between being good at metalwork and independently discovering electrochemistry about 1,800 years before. Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the battery in 1800. Let's break down how this thing would theoretically work, because that's important. A battery, in the simplest terms, is a device that converts chemical energy into electrical energy through a chemical reaction. You need three basic components, two different metals, called electrodes, and an electrolyte, which is a substance that allows ions to move between the electrodes. In a modern battery, like the ones in your phone or your TV remote, you might have a zinc and carbon electrode with an acidic or alkaline electrolyte between them. Looking at the Baghdad Battery, we've got our copper cylinder, that's one electrode. We've got our iron rod, that's the second electrode. But here's the thing, for this to work, you need an electrolyte. König and others who supported this theory suggested that the jar would have been filled with an acidic liquid, perhaps vinegar or wine. Now, if you did fill this thing with vinegar or wine or lemon juice or any acidic solution, something interesting would indeed happen. The acid would react with the metals, causing ions to flow from one electrode to the other, creating a small electrical current. This is basically the same principle as the voltaic pile that Alessandro Volta created in 1800, which is generally credited as the first true battery. If you actually test this design, which people have done because scientists love proving or disproving weird theories, you can generate about 1 to 2 volts of electricity. That's not a lot. Your phone battery is 3.7 volts, for comparison. But 1 to 2 volts is theoretically enough to do electroplating if you're very patient and not in a hurry to get anywhere. Think of it like trying to fill an Olympic swimming pool with an eyedropper. Technically possible, but you're going to be there for a very, very long time. So König's theory sat there for a while, being one of those interesting historical oddities that people would mention at cocktail parties to sound smart. Then, in 1978, a guy named Willard Gray, who worked at General Electric's high-voltage laboratory, decided to actually test the theory properly. He built a replica of the Baghdad Battery, filled it with grape juice, because apparently he wanted the ancient Parthians to have access to Welches, and measured the output. He got about 1.5 to 2 volts, which was consistent with what the theory predicted. Gray then connected several of these replicas in series, meaning he linked them up like a chain to add their voltages together, and he successfully electroplated a small silver statue with gold. So, case closed, right? The ancient Parthians had batteries, they were electroplating jewelry, and we can all go home feeling like we've solved one of history's mysteries. Not so fast. Because here's where things get messy. And by messy, I mean archaeologists start throwing pottery shards at each other at conferences messy. First problem, we have absolutely zero evidence that the Parthians did any electroplating. None. Zip. Nada. We have lots of Parthian metalwork, and some of it is quite beautiful, but all of it can be explained by techniques we know they had, like gold leaf application, mercury gilding, and good old-fashioned gold alloy work. Mercury gilding, by the way, is exactly what it sounds like. You mix gold with mercury to make a paste, paint it on your object, then heat it up so the mercury evaporates and leaves the gold behind. It works great, except for the minor detail that you're breathing mercury vapor, which is why a lot of ancient gilders probably didn't make it to retirement age. But the Parthians definitely knew how to do this. We have evidence for it. What we don't have evidence for is electroplating. Second problem, we've never found these objects connected to anything. If you're going to do electroplating, you need to connect your battery to the object you're plating. You need wires or something conductive. We've found none of that. No copper wires, no connection mechanisms, nothing. It's like finding what appears to be a steering wheel, but no evidence anyone ever built a car. Third problem, and this is a big one, the dating of these objects is all over the place. König initially dated them to the Parthian period, somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. But later analyses suggested they might be Sasanian, which would put them between 224 CE and 650 CE. And some scholars think they might be even later than that. The archaeological context is, to use a technical term, a hot mess. The excavations weren't documented with modern standards. We don't have clear stratigraphy, which is the layering of archaeological deposits that helps us date things, and the site itself has been disturbed multiple times over the centuries. Fourth problem, If the Parthians had discovered how to generate and use electricity, why don't we see any progression or development of this technology? Scientific discoveries don't just appear fully formed and then disappear. They get refined, improved, and spread. The Romans, who were in constant contact with the Parthians, mostly by hitting each other with swords, should have encountered this technology. And the Romans were enthusiastic adopters of useful technology. They loved aqueducts, concrete, and really good roads. If they'd seen electroplating, they would have been all over it, like senators on a good omen. But we have zero evidence the Romans knew about or used anything resembling batteries or electroplating. So if these things weren't batteries, what were they? This is where we get into the alternative theories, and there are several, each with their own proponents who will defend their position with the passion of someone arguing about the correct way to pronounce GIF. Theory number 1. They were storage vessels for sacred scrolls. This theory suggests that the copper cylinder was meant to protect valuable papyrus or parchment documents from moisture and decay. The iron rod might have been a kind of spindle or support for the scrolls. The problem with this theory is that it's a really weird way to store scrolls, and we have plenty of evidence for how ancient people actually stored scrolls, and it looked nothing like this. It's like suggesting that a shoebox is actually an ancient helmet. Sure, you could wear it on your head, but that's probably not what it was for. Theory number 2. They were containers for precious or magical substances. Maybe they held special oils, perfumes, or substances used in religious rituals. The metal components might have been there to keep the contents pure, or to add some kind of mystical significance. Ancient people were really into the symbolic properties of metals. Gold was associated with the sun and immortality, silver with the moon, copper with Venus, and so on. So having a copper and iron container might have had symbolic meaning we don't fully understand. This theory has the advantage of not requiring the Parthians to have independently discovered electrochemistry, but it also doesn't explain why you'd need both metals in this specific configuration. Theory number 3. And this one's my personal favorite for sheer creativity. They were used in ancient medical practices, specifically for some form of electrotherapy or acupuncture. This theory suggests that if you did fill these things with an acidic solution and generate a current, you might feel a slight tingle if you touched the electrodes. Some researchers have proposed that ancient physicians might have used this tingling sensation for pain relief or to treat various ailments. Now, before you laugh, electrotherapy is actually a real thing in modern medicine. We use electrical stimulation for pain management, physical therapy, and other applications. The ancient Greeks and Romans knew that electric fish, like torpedo rays, could produce shocks, and there are references to using these fish medicinally. But here's the thing. We have detailed medical texts from the ancient world, including from the Parthian period and surrounding areas. They talk about all kinds of treatments, some sensible, some absolutely bonkers, but none of them mention anything that sounds like using these jar devices for medical purposes. Theory number 4. They weren't functional objects at all in the way we're thinking. Maybe they were ceremonial or symbolic items whose purpose we simply don't understand because we're missing the cultural context. Archaeology is full of objects that we've completely misinterpreted because we're trying to understand them through our modern lens. For example, there are ancient stone spheres in Scotland that for years people thought were weapons or tools, but more recent analysis suggests they might have been prestige objects or had some kind of spiritual significance. Maybe the Baghdad Battery is similar. Maybe the copper and iron weren't meant to generate electricity, but represented the union of different materials for some religious or magical reason. Now, there's another theory that's been gaining traction in recent years, and it's possibly the most mundane, but also potentially the most accurate. Several scholars have suggested that these aren't Parthian artifacts at all, and they might not even be ancient. Some researchers think they could be from the much later Sasanian period or even medieval Islamic period. And here's the really anticlimactic part. They might just be storage jars for papyrus documents, with the metal components being reinforcement or decoration that we're over-interpreting. In 2003, a researcher named Paul Craddock from the British Museum published a thorough analysis of these objects, and he was pretty skeptical of the battery hypothesis. He pointed out that the copper cylinders show evidence of being made by rolling copper sheet, a technique that's consistent with ancient Mesopotamian metalworking. But the way they're constructed doesn't seem optimized for electrical generation. If you were deliberately trying to make a battery, you'd probably do things differently. The iron rods show heavy corrosion, which is consistent with them being in contact with an acidic substance, but that doesn't mean it was intentional. It could just mean that whatever organic material was stored in these jars broke down over time and became acidic, corroding the iron. There's also the issue of König himself and the context in which he made his claims. He was working in the late 1930s in Iraq, a time and place where there was considerable interest in finding evidence of advanced ancient civilizations. The discovery of something that suggested ancient peoples were more technologically advanced than previously thought was exciting and brought attention. Not to suggest König was being dishonest, but scientists are human, and humans see what they want to see sometimes. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing. If you're looking for evidence of ancient batteries, you might interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting that theory. Let's talk for a moment about why this story has such staying power, because it really does. The Baghdad Battery has appeared in countless documentaries, books, and even TV shows. It's become one of those ancient mysteries that people love to talk about. Why? I think it's because we love the idea that ancient people were more advanced than we give them credit for. There's something appealing about the notion that our ancestors weren't primitive, that they figured out things we thought were modern inventions. It makes history feel more interesting, more mysterious. There's also a broader phenomenon at work here, sometimes called ancient alien syndrome, though that's not a technical term. This is the tendency to attribute any ancient achievement that seems impressive to either extraterrestrial help or lost super-advanced civilizations. You see this with the pyramids, Stonehenge, the Nazca lines, and yes, the Baghdad Battery. The underlying assumption, often unconscious, is that ancient people couldn't possibly have been smart enough to build or create these things on their own. Which, when you think about it, is kind of insulting to our ancestors. The ancient Mesopotamians, including the Parthians, were brilliant. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, and developed sophisticated legal codes and agricultural systems. The Babylonians were doing complex mathematics that would make modern high school students weep. They had a base 60 number system, which is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. They could predict eclipses. They built the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though admittedly we're not entirely sure those actually existed, but that's a whole other conversation. My point is, these people were not primitive. They didn't need batteries to prove they were smart. Here's the thing about the Baghdad Battery that really gets me. Whether or not it actually was a battery is almost beside the point. What's more interesting is what this object tells us about how we do archaeology and history. We have an artifact that we don't fully understand, with unclear provenance, meaning we don't know exactly where it came from or when it was made. We have a hypothesis that's exciting and gets people's attention but lacks strong supporting evidence. And we have a bunch of alternative explanations that are less exciting but might be more accurate. This is actually pretty normal in archaeology. We find stuff all the time that we can't immediately explain. The difference is that most of it doesn't capture the public imagination the way the Baghdad Battery has. Nobody's making documentaries about the ancient clay pot that might have held grain, or maybe olive oil. We're not really sure. But they should, because that's what most archaeology actually looks like. Let me give you another example of how we can misinterpret ancient objects. There's a famous Roman dodecahedron. Actually, there are lots of them. Over 100 found across the Roman Empire. These are hollow bronze objects with 12 flat faces. each face having a circular hole of different size, and there are knobs at each corner. They're found in northern Europe, mostly in Gaul, Germania, and Britain, dating from the 2nd to 4th centuries CE. And here's the kicker: we have absolutely no idea what they were for. None. Not a clue. They're never mentioned in Roman texts. We've found them in various contexts, some in hoards with coins, some in graves, some just lying around. Theories range from surveying instruments to candlestick holders to dice to religious objects to toys. Some people think they were used to determine the optimal sowing date for winter grain. Others think they were used to calibrate water pipes. The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. But they're not famous like the Baghdad Battery, because you can't make a catchy TV show called The Ancient Object that we think might have been a thing, but we're really not sure. And it's kind of boring, actually. So where does that leave us with the Baghdad Battery? The scientific consensus, if there is such a thing, is that these objects probably weren't batteries in any intentional sense. Could they generate a small electrical current if filled with an acidic solution? Yes. Did the Parthians or whoever made them know this and use them for this purpose? Almost certainly not. They're more likely to be storage containers, possibly for sacred or valuable materials, that we've gotten overly excited about because we want ancient civilizations to be more like us. But here's where I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit, because that's what good scholars do. We can't say with absolute 100% certainty that these weren't used to generate electricity. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found proof that the Parthians were doing electroplating doesn't mean they absolutely weren't. Maybe the evidence has been lost or destroyed. Maybe it's sitting in some museum basement labeled incorrectly. Maybe we just haven't found it yet. Iraq has been through a lot in the past few decades, and countless archaeological sites have been looted, destroyed, or have become inaccessible. The Iraq Museum itself was extensively looted in 2003 during the Iraq War, and some estimate that thousands of artifacts were stolen or destroyed. Sadly, this includes most or all of the actual Baghdad Battery artifacts. They're gone. We can't do modern analysis on them with current technology. All we have are the old descriptions, some photographs, and the replicas that people have made. This brings up an important point about archaeology and historical research in general. Our understanding of the past is always incomplete and always subject to revision. Every few years, someone makes a discovery that changes what we thought we knew. In 1991, hikers in the Alps found a frozen mummy that came to be known as Ötzi the Iceman. He died around 3300 BCE, over 5,000 years ago. The level of preservation was incredible, and Ötzi has taught us enormous amounts about Copper Age Europe. His clothing, tools, and even his stomach contents have been analyzed. We know what he ate for his last meal. We know he had bad teeth and probably chronic Lyme disease. We know he was murdered, shot with an arrow. None of this was in any historical text. We only know it because we found physical evidence. Similarly, we used to think that Neanderthals were brutish and primitive compared to modern humans. But recent discoveries have shown they were making art, burying their dead with what appear to be grave goods, possibly making jewelry, and definitely interbreeding with modern humans, which is why most people of European and Asian descent have some Neanderthal DNA. Our view of Neanderthals has completely changed in the last 20 years based on new evidence and new analysis techniques. So, could future discoveries prove that the Baghdad Battery really was a battery? Could we find ancient electroplating workshops or texts describing the technique? Could someone dig up a cache of these devices all wired together in series? I suppose it's possible. I wouldn't bet my salary on it, but I can't completely rule it out. And that's okay. That's what makes history and archaeology interesting. There's always more to learn. Let's talk about some of the practical problems with the battery hypothesis that really seal the deal for me. First, copper and iron in an acidic solution don't make a great battery. They work, but barely. The voltage is low and the current is weak. If you wanted to do electroplating efficiently, you'd want something with more oomph. Modern electroplating uses much higher voltages and currents. You could theoretically do it with these devices, but it would take forever. You'd need multiple jars wired together, and you'd need to keep replacing the acidic solution because it gets used up in the reaction. It's like trying to power a modern city with a potato battery. Sure, you can generate electricity with a potato, stick a zinc electrode and a copper electrode in it, and you'll get a tiny current. Kids do it for science fairs all the time. But you wouldn't try to run your refrigerator with it. Second, if the Parthians were doing electroplating, even inefficient slow electroplating, we should see evidence of it in the quality and characteristics of their metalwork. Electroplated objects have a very even, thin layer of the plating metal. Other gilding techniques, like gold leaf or mercury gilding, have different characteristics that we can detect with modern analysis techniques like X-ray fluorescence or scanning electron microscopy. And when we analyze Parthian gilded objects, they show characteristics consistent with mercury gilding and gold leaf, not electroplating. Third, and this is perhaps the most damning point, the Parthians and their neighbors had access to techniques for working with precious metals that were actually quite sophisticated and didn't require electricity. They could draw gold into wire, fine enough to use in filigree work. They could make granulation, which involves attaching tiny beads of gold to a surface without melting either the beads or the surface, something that requires incredibly precise temperature control and that modern jewelers struggle to replicate. They could cast complex shapes using lost wax casting. They could hammer gold leaf thin enough to be nearly transparent. These are not the techniques of people who needed electroplating to make their metalwork look nice. They were already masters of their craft. Let's also consider the broader context of ancient scientific knowledge. The ancient world definitely had people we'd recognize as scientists and engineers. Archimedes, who lived from about 287 to 212 BCE, understood principles of leverage, buoyancy, and geometry. He supposedly designed war machines to defend Syracuse from Roman siege. Heron of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE, designed all kinds of mechanical devices, including a primitive steam engine called an aeolipile, though it was never used for anything practical, just as a novelty. The point is, when ancient people made significant technological or scientific discoveries, they wrote about them. We have texts, lots of them. The Library of Alexandria, before it burned or decayed or gradually declined depending on which historical account you believe, contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. We don't have most of them anymore, but we have references to them, and we have some texts that survived. And yet, nowhere in any ancient text from Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, or anywhere else do we have any mention of using electrical current for plating metals or any other purpose. We have lots of texts about metallurgy, including detailed recipes for alloys and techniques for working metals. We have texts about chemistry, even though they didn't call it chemistry and some of it was mixed up with alchemy. We have texts about medicine, agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy, but nothing about batteries or electricity in the way we understand it. Now, ancient people were definitely aware of static electricity. The ancient Greeks knew that if you rubbed amber with fur, it would attract light objects like feathers or hair. The Greek word for amber is electron, which is where we get our word electricity, but they didn't understand it as a force or energy that could be harnessed and used. They thought it was a curious property of amber, maybe something magical. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, they knew about electric fish like torpedo rays that could deliver shocks. These fish were sometimes used in medicine. The Roman physician Scribonius Largus, writing in the 1st century CE, described using torpedo ray shocks to treat headaches and gout. Patients would stand on the fish or touch it until their foot went numb from the shock, which sounds like medieval torture, but was apparently considered therapeutic. But knowing that amber can attract things when rubbed and that some fish can deliver shocks is very different from understanding electricity as a phenomenon that can be generated, stored, and used to do work. It's the difference between noticing that things fall down and formulating the law of universal gravitation. The conceptual leap is enormous. This raises an interesting question. Why didn't ancient people develop electricity, despite having some of the necessary components and observations? They had metals, they had acids, they had static electricity and electric fish. Why didn't someone put it all together? And the answer, I think, is that scientific progress isn't inevitable or straightforward. It requires not just materials and observations, but a whole framework of thinking, the right questions being asked, usually a need or application that drives research, and often just plain luck. Alessandro Volta didn't invent the battery in 1800 because he was smarter than everyone who came before him. He invented it because he was working in a specific intellectual context, with centuries of developing scientific method behind him, in response to a scientific controversy about animal electricity versus metallic electricity, with access to precision instruments and measurement techniques. And, yeah, okay, because he was pretty smart. Let me tell you about the actual development of the battery, because it's a good story, and it helps illustrate why the Baghdad Battery probably wasn't one. In the late 1700s, Luigi Galvani, an Italian physician and physicist, was doing experiments with frog legs. He noticed that dead frog legs would twitch when he touched them with metal instruments during a lightning storm. He did more experiments and found he could make the frog legs twitch by touching them with two different metals. Galvani thought he'd discovered animal electricity, that the life force was electrical in nature and was stored in animal tissue. This was actually a pretty reasonable hypothesis, given what he'd observed. But Alessandro Volta disagreed. He thought the electricity wasn't coming from the frog, but from the contact between two different metals, with the frog tissue just acting as a wet conductor. To prove his point, Volta built a device in 1800 that he called a voltaic pile. It was a stack of alternating copper and zinc discs separated by cloth or cardboard soaked in salt water. No frog required. This device could produce a steady electrical current, and it was the first true battery. The scientific world went nuts. This was huge. Suddenly you could generate electricity on demand, not just by rubbing amber or spinning a primitive generator. You could store electrical potential and release it when needed. Within a few years, people were using voltaic piles to decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen, to discover new elements like sodium and potassium, and to do all kinds of electrochemistry. The key point here is that Volta's invention came out of a specific scientific context and controversy. It was developed deliberately, with the understanding of what it was and how it worked. It was immediately recognized as important, widely written about, and quickly adopted and improved by other scientists. None of that happened with the Baghdad Battery. There's no ancient controversy about animal versus metallic electricity. There's no sudden flourishing of ancient electrochemistry after its invention. There's no written record of what it was, or how to use it. It just sits there in the archaeological record, a mysterious object that maybe could have generated a tiny current if someone had filled it with vinegar, but probably nobody did. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier, the looting and destruction of Iraqi archaeological sites and museums. This is a tragedy that extends far beyond the Baghdad Battery. Iraq is one of the most archaeologically rich regions in the world. It's ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. This is where writing was invented, where cities first developed, where agriculture began, where mathematics and astronomy and literature all have some of their earliest expressions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, comes from ancient Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written law codes, comes from Babylon, and we've lost so much. During the 2003 looting of the Iraq Museum, an estimated 15,000 artifacts were stolen. Some have been recovered, but many haven't. Archaeological sites across Iraq have been systematically looted for decades. People dig up artifacts to sell on the black market. Sites are destroyed by conflict. The ancient city of Nimrud, an Assyrian city with incredible carved reliefs and sculptures, was heavily damaged by ISIS in 2015. They bulldozed parts of the site and blew up monuments. The loss is incalculable. This matters for our discussion because we'll never be able to properly analyze the original Baghdad Battery artifacts with modern techniques. We can't carbon date the organic materials that might have been inside. We can't do detailed metallurgical analysis of the copper and iron. We can't examine microscopic traces that might tell us what the jars actually contained. We're left with old descriptions and photographs in our imaginations. And that's frustrating because if these objects are as important as some people claim, we should be able to study them properly. But we can't, because they're gone. Okay, let's imagine for a moment, just as a thought experiment, that the Baghdad Battery really was an intentionally designed electrical device. What would that mean? Well, first, it would mean that someone in ancient Mesopotamia made an absolutely extraordinary discovery and then either didn't realize how significant it was or didn't successfully communicate it to anyone else. Because remember, the technology didn't spread or develop further. It would be like someone inventing the smartphone in the Middle Ages and then everyone forgetting about it and going back to using carrier pigeons. Second, it would raise questions about what they used it for. The electroplating hypothesis has problems, as we've discussed, but what's the alternative? Were they just playing with it? Did they notice the tingle and think it was magical? Did they use it for something we haven't even thought of? One possibility that's been suggested is that it could have been used in some kind of temple context, maybe to create a magical or miraculous effect. Imagine you're a priest in an ancient temple, and you can make metal objects tingle or create a small spark. To people who don't understand electricity, that would seem like divine power. There are documented cases of priests in various ancient religions using hidden mechanisms to create miracles. The ancient Egyptians had doors in temples that would open automatically, operated by a hydraulic system. When the priest lit a fire on the altar, the heat would cause air to expand and push water through tubes, which would pull the doors open. To worshippers, it looked like the gods were opening the doors in response to the sacrifice. So maybe the Baghdad Battery was something similar, a priestly trick. But again, we have no evidence for this. It's pure speculation. Third, if the Baghdad Battery was a real battery, it would mean we need to completely reevaluate our understanding of ancient scientific knowledge. It would open up possibilities that maybe other ancient technologies existed that we don't know about. Maybe there are other artifacts we've misidentified or overlooked. Maybe ancient people understood more about the natural world than we give them credit for. And actually, that last point is probably true regardless of whether the Baghdad Battery was a battery or not. We tend to underestimate ancient people's knowledge and capabilities. But here's the thing. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a fundamental principle of scientific skepticism. If someone tells you they have a regular car, you'll probably believe them. If someone tells you they have a car that runs on water and can fly and also travels through time, you're going to need some pretty convincing proof. The Baghdad Battery is closer to the time-traveling flying water car. It's an extraordinary claim. Sure, it's possible, but we need extraordinary evidence to believe it, and we don't have that evidence. What we have is an artifact that superficially resembles a battery, that can theoretically generate a small current under certain conditions, that comes from a poorly documented archaeological context, that has no supporting evidence in terms of what it was used for or why it was made, and that has several alternative explanations that are more consistent with what we know about ancient technology and culture. Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, would suggest that these objects weren't batteries. But let's be honest, the simple explanation isn't as fun. The idea that ancient Mesopotamians discovered electricity is exciting. It captures the imagination, It suggests mystery and lost knowledge. It makes a good story. And humans love good stories. We love mystery and the unknown. That's why conspiracy theories are so appealing, why people believe in UFOs and Bigfoot and lost civilizations. Not because the evidence is strong, but because the story is compelling. And you know what? That's okay. I'm not here to rain on everyone's parade. If people want to believe the Baghdad Battery was a battery, that's their choice. Where it becomes a problem is when people present speculation and possibility as proven fact, or when they reject evidence that contradicts what they want to believe. Good science, good history, good archaeology all require us to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it's less exciting than we'd hoped. So, what can we say with confidence about the Baghdad Battery? We can say it's a genuine ancient artifact, probably from somewhere between 200 BCE and 600 CE, though the exact date is uncertain. We can say it consists of a ceramic jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. We can say that if filled with an acidic solution, it could theoretically generate a small electrical current. We can say that we don't have convincing evidence that it was actually used for this purpose. We can say that the electroplating hypothesis has significant problems. And we can say that alternative explanations, while less exciting, are more consistent with what we know about the period. What we can't say is that it definitely was a battery used for electroplating. We also can't say that it definitely wasn't. The honest answer, the one that good scholars should give, is we don't know for sure, but probably not. And that's a perfectly acceptable answer. Not knowing is okay. Uncertainty is a feature of historical research, not a bug. What matters is that we're honest about what we know, what we don't know, and what we're just guessing at. I think the Baghdad Battery tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the ancient world. It tells us that we're fascinated by the idea of lost knowledge and ancient wisdom. It tells us that we sometimes want ancient people to be more like us, to have our technology and our understanding. It tells us that a good story can overshadow careful analysis. And it tells us that archaeology is hard, that interpreting the material remains of the past is complicated and often frustrating, and that we don't always get neat, satisfying answers. The truth is, most of archaeology is unglamorous. It's careful measurement, detailed cataloging, soil analysis, and statistical modeling. It's spending months excavating a site and finding mostly broken pottery and some post holes. It's writing reports that read like, Layer 4 contained fragmentary ceramic vessels consistent with domestic use, dating to the late Iron Age based on stratigraphic position and associated material culture. Not exactly the stuff of Indiana Jones movies, but occasionally, just occasionally, you find something weird. Something that doesn't fit. Something that makes you scratch your head and wonder. And those moments are what make it all worthwhile. The Baghdad Battery is one of those weird things. Whether it was actually a battery or not, it's sparked decades of debate, research, and public interest. It's gotten people excited about archaeology and ancient history. It's made people think about what ancient civilizations were capable of. And even if the final conclusion is that it was just a jar with some metal in it, I'd argue that's okay. The journey of inquiry, of asking questions and seeking evidence, is valuable in itself. In conclusion, if I had to put money on it, I'd bet that the Baghdad Battery was not actually a battery in any intentional sense. It was probably a storage vessel for scrolls or other organic materials, or possibly something with religious or symbolic significance that we don't fully understand. The metals might have been structural or decorative elements that we're reading too much into. The fact that it could generate a tiny current if filled with acid is probably just an interesting coincidence, not evidence of advanced ancient electrochemistry. But I could be wrong. Future discoveries might change our understanding. Maybe someone will find an ancient text that describes these devices and their use. Maybe a new excavation will uncover a workshop full of them with clear evidence of their function. Maybe some new analytical technique will reveal traces that definitively show what they contained and what they were for. Science and history are always provisional, always subject to revision based on new evidence. What I hope you take away from today's lesson is not just information about one weird artifact, but a broader understanding of how we interpret the past, how we evaluate evidence, how we balance skepticism with open-mindedness, and how we resist the urge to jump to exciting conclusions without sufficient proof. These are skills that apply far beyond archaeology. They're the foundation of critical thinking in general. Also, I hope you've learned that the Parthians were pretty cool even if they didn't invent batteries. They built an empire, fought the Romans, controlled crucial trade routes, produced beautiful art and architecture, and generally made their mark on history. We don't need to give them credit for inventing electricity to recognize their achievements. They're impressive enough on their own merits. And finally, I hope you've gained an appreciation for how much of the past is mysterious and unknown. For every question we can answer about ancient civilizations, there are 10 more we can't. There are countless artifacts in museums around the world labeled Purpose Unknown. There are ancient scripts we haven't deciphered. There are archaeological sites that haven't been excavated. There are questions we haven't even thought to ask yet. The past is not a closed book. It's an ongoing investigation, and you could be part of it. Whether the Baghdad Battery turns out to be an ancient electrical device or just an unusually shaped jar, it's done its job of making us curious, making us question, and making us think. And in the end, isn't that what the best mysteries do? Good night. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.